So I figured I'd bite the bullet, become a corporate lawyer for a couple of years, and then figure out what I wanted to do. I always knew I was not going to be a lawyer. Why don't I just start New York's first night market? I fell asleep that night, and I woke up like, well, that sounds like something I could do that could impact New York City forever and ever. And so that day, I decided I would spend a year trying to do that. At the time, there was 2 competing night markets in Vancouver, and then like a once-a-year night market in LA. And that was, as far as I could tell, that was all that existed in North America. And in like 11 years, somehow the Financial Times listed us as a top 10 market in the entire world.
Welcome back to Infinite Loops. I'm Jim O'Shaughnessy. Today's guest is John Wang, the founder of Queens Night Market, one of the most joyful civic hacks in New York City. John was a Yale-trained lawyer who burned out, walked away from the clean, high-status track, and decided to build something weirdly ambitious. Please enjoy my conversation with John Wang. John Wang, founder of the Queens Night Market. Welcome. I am so taken by your story, and I want to start at the beginning because you made a huge career decision, right? You were Yale-trained lawyer, on the fast track, and then you were kind of like, this is not working for me. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me. So you want me to go tell you?
I want your superhero origin story.
Origin story. Well, born and raised in Texas. Wanted to leave. I was not a very particularly good high school student, so I wanted to, which meant I couldn't go to the good local schools. UT Austin was sort of where everyone tends to go, but you have to be pretty high in your class. And I actually was just a kind of a terrible high school student. Never went to class. Decided I would go to the best college that would take me as far away as possible from Texas. So I went to University of Michigan, spent 4 years there. Graduated.
Ann Arbor?
Ann Arbor, yeah.
Yep. Beautiful college town.
Yeah, not bad. I mean, if you like college towns. Triple majored there, and then finished up in 4 years, moved back to Texas, played poker and pool for a little while, and then got into law school, went to Yale Law School. Then I was working for the dean of the business school, so joined the joint degree to the MBA as well, and then left with a bunch of student debt, was the big question, or the big sort of looming cloud over me. And I figured I would, so I graduated during the recession and tried to figure out what the best way to pay off the student loans was, because it was either investment bank or law firm. When I was graduating, the stories were, investment bankers jumping out of the building because they only got, $100,000 in bonuses. And so it's like, well, and then law firms at that time weren't able, I don't know if it's still true, but it was bad PR for them to fire anyone. So they just had to hold on to their entire staff. So I figured I'd bite the bullet, become a corporate lawyer for a couple of years, and then figure out what I wanted to do once I hit up a student loan.
Let me stop you because I have a couple of questions.
Please.
Something that I've noticed, I have no empirical data for, so this is a vibe, right? But so many people who do really interesting, innovative, creative things were not great in high school. So what about your case?
So
were you just bored by it?
Maybe. I am not a good student.
Says the guy who's got a JD and an MBA from Yale.
Right. No, but there's a lot of background to that, right? So I'm probably a very good test taker. The reason I was not a good student in high school is because I didn't ever go to class, and there were lots of attendance requirements and that kind of thing. I think if you gave me a test, I'd probably do pretty well. I can't tell you whether it was boredom or just not liking school, but also when I went to college, despite having 3 majors, I also never went to class.
We share that, by the way.
Good. Well, good. And I actually went out of my way to figure out how to escape the attendance requirements.
Me too.
And so much so that I became a thing that I would go into a class and propose to the professor. I would say, I know you have an attendance requirement. I'll make a deal with you. I'll take all your tests. If I get an A, you waive the attendance requirement. If I get anything less than A, you can do whatever you want with the attendance requirement. And surprisingly, a lot of them said, okay, that's a weird proposition, but sure, go ahead. And that's how I ended up.
And what was it that made you not want to go to class?
I don't know. To this day, if you try to stick me in a classroom, I'd probably freak out. I get very jittery. I get, it's not claustrophobia. I don't know. Maybe it's some sort of deep anti-authoritarianism.
Oh,
I don't know what it is.
I knew that I was going to love you because I try to avoid all of the insane, crazy political debates.
Yep.
But what I will always go with is I am fiercely anti-authoritarian.
Yeah. There's this funny story, and I was in a seminar at law school, and it was only like one day a month or something, so you had to go. And I had a friend who was beside me, and I remember you could use your laptops, and I was like Googling, Nintendo games that you'd play. And, I started playing this old Nintendo game, but started to get really into it. There's only like 6 people in the class or something like that. And so I'm sitting next to my friend, and I'm just, it's a 3-hour seminar, but at some point I'm just so involved in my game, and then I'm like clacking loudly, and my friend just starts poking me and like, John, stop. And I look up, the entire class has stopped, and everyone's staring at me because I'm just like jamming on these buttons, and everyone apparently had bbeen like quiet for like 3 minutes. Everyone's just staring at me, wondering what I'm doing, and how can someone take notes so so vehemently taking notes? But it was actually just playing like a fighting game. I think it was oh my god, I was so embarrassed. My friend was embarrassed, and I think they took a coffee break after that.
When you took the corporate legal job, you were looking at that as a gig. You weren't going to make that your career.
For sure. No, I counted down the days until I could pay off my loans and then figure out. I'm sort of doomed to not be satisfied, I think. So, I'm not sure there's a dream job out there for me other than, pure retirement, whatever that means. But yeah, it was definitely counting down the days. And I don't mean that I'm not a miserable person, but, I knew, it was temporary.
And then what was the inspiration for the night market?
A couple of things. So just why night market was definitely childhood summers in Taiwan. Each city has a bajillion night markets. So they're all super fun. And I remember every summer when I would go, all I wanted to do every single night was force my family to take me because they're super fun. These fun games, the food and all that stuff. My lawyer days, and shortly thereafter, I was still traveling a bit. And, I found myself always wanting to either go to the local markets or the local night markets. Anywhere I went, that's all I really care to do. And my wife is probably displeased that I'm not a museum person and I'm not a sightseer. All I really want to do is go check out what the people are doing, the locals. When I finished the law firm, I dabbled in a couple of projects. They all depended on someone else's specialized skills. So one was an app, depended on a developer. One, I was going to move to Milan to start a Texas barbecue with my friend. He got cold feet. And then I was going to start a weather consultancy company with a superstar meteorologist who I grew up with. And they all got cold feet or disappeared. And, I'd spent a year spinning my wheels and then decided I was going to move to New Orleans. I love New Orleans. I've always loved it. And then when I was about to move, I gave myself 2 weeks to think of something to do in New York City. Convinced my Italian friend, to start he's old school Italian, loves talking, loves Italy. His English is better than most Americans. So I was trying to convince him to do the world's biggest Italian import-export expo. He gets to talk, he gets to schmooze, he gets to do all the stuff that he loves to do. And he thought it was a very good idea, but then just got cold feet again. Or just thought, I think he used the word chicken shit. So anyways, I fell asleep that night and I woke up well, that sounds like something I could do, not necessarily an expo, but why don't I just start New York's first night market? I was like, well, that could change. That could impact New York City forever and ever. And so that day I decided I would spend a year trying to do that. But at the time there was 2 competing night markets in Vancouver and then a once a year night market in LA. And that was, as far as I could tell, that was all that existed in North America. And the thing with those 3, they were all 95, 99% Asian focused, which makes a lot of sense if you look at sort of the storied night markets around the world. They tend to be Asian. But I thought, if this is my reason for staying in New York City, I have to make it New York in and out. Everything about it has to speak New York, except the price cap, right? And the price cap, which in 2015, 2016 was $5, so any food you could buy. In 2017, we moved it to $6, and it's been there since. So that was kind of an FU to New York, right? I wasn't having a paycheck. I couldn't believe how expensive New York was without a paycheck. And I was still on the privileged side, right? I had a good paycheck, and it probably had a resume that if I really needed to, I could probably go find a job. But even still, New York was just unbelievably unaffordable. So the 2 premises that the night market, the Queens night market, was founded upon was, 1, represent as many New Yorkers through a sort of gross proxy, but country of origin as possible, and 2, to impose a price cap to make it necessarily or matter of fact the cheapest and most affordable place in New York City.
Yeah, I want to follow up on 2 things. You mentioned all of these other ideas. you were going to do with somebody, but they got cold feet,
Yeah.
right? Like that's something that we notice a lot through our venture arm, where we sort of specialize on pre-seed. In other words, hey, you'd make a good founder to seed, and yet what's really required is agency, right? You've got to actually roll up your sleeves and go do it. When I was listening to you, I was like, wow, that seems like a lot of people to opt out because of cold feet. Obviously, you don't have cold feet. And what do you think? Like, what do you think was the separation?
I have the personality that, like, I always knew I was not going to be a lawyer, at least for a long time. And, you know, I have to take a little bit step back. I meet a lot of, you know, since the night market started, we've launched about 500 businesses in New York City.
Which is astounding. I think it's just like you should be incredibly, deeply congratulated for that.
Yeah, but, you know, they're not all success stories, right? There's a lot of people that are packed up. And so, like, it's a big number, but, you know, now pigeonholed as the kind of guy that knows how to spur entrepreneurship, like very micro businesses, right? Like, we're not talking venture stuff. But I always tell people, like, one, you should never start a small business. Terrible idea. Like, idiotic idea. The percentages are terrible. Yale Law School has this new, I don't know, fairly new initiative called like the Che Fellowship Program, where they try to incentivize, well, they try to tell Yale law students that you don't have to be a lawyer, you can go private. And, you know, there are all sorts of different avenues and the world opens up when you go to Yale Law School. So they come every year to the night market now and I host them and sort of, they ask me for my candidate advice. I've usually had a few beers. And I started saying this like sort of off the cuff, but I started to believe it more and more that normally I would say a person should not start a small business from the, you know, just the odds and like the tax on your life and like how it can upend your life. But I told the law students, like, you guys should take risks, right? You have what I had the benefit of was sort of a resume, hireability, even if, you know, shit hit the fan. And, you know, the reason I was sort of like, I thought the night market would try it for a year and then I'd crash and burn and I'd go do something else. I might go like begging someone to hire me. But like the truth is, you know, with that on my resume, I probably could get hired. So I told, you know, the Yale law students that they had the benefit of like a plan B, right? Which most families don't. Like most families that like, you know, start a dry cleaner or whatever it is, like a bodega, don't have a plan B. And like if that fails, their livelihoods are severely, you know, impacted. The Yale law students, like, you know, once they get there, they're in the sort of rarefied air where they have a lot of options. And I told them, look, you guys, outside of being a lawyer if you want, outside of being a clerk if you want, or going to private equity, whatever, you can all make lots of money. But if you actually want, you have the privilege of taking huge risks and not having it ultimately like permanently affect your livelihood, right? Like you can just go do something else. And so anyways, I don't know where I got to that tangent, but like that's how I feel about it. Like I think most people should not start small businesses. I think it's a losing proposition, but there are certain people in the world who, you know, can do it without so much of a risk.
So let's walk through two vendors, and you don't have to name them, obviously. Sure. They come to you. They're like, they get that advice, right? Yep. Hey, small businesses are rough, but they persist, yep, right? What kind of guidance do you give them? And then walk me through one that did really well and then one that didn't.
If you can persist through so many no's and so many people telling you not to do it, like there's something to be said about that. Your odds of making it are probably, you know, incrementally higher than someone who just sort of, you know, didn't have to go through that gauntlet of no's. So the night market is exceptional. Like, I don't mean like exceptional from a value proposition, just means it's like unique in that I've structured it in a way that even if you lost everything you invested in setting up your business and coming to the night market, it's, you know, maximum $1,000, $2,000. Oh, right. Okay, wow. And so like, there's no magic, I think, behind spurring like really micro businesses. Like, just make it affordable to lose, right? Like, and then we've also like, we're popular enough, I think, at least in terms of like visitorship, that it's very unlikely you won't at least break even, right? So I always try to sort of level set like what I'm telling people not to start businesses. Like, you can try the night market, whatever. Like, it costs you, you know, probably $500 or $1,000 to get in. You lose that. I hope that doesn't affect your livelihood. But to like take on a lease is a completely different matter in New York City, right? So, so there's that. Like, we are sort of artificial test beds, that's incubator or whatever. What makes it, you know, success stories? You know, I also think it's funny talking to, you know, successful investor, because like, you know, I assume a lot of very presumptuous, but a lot of what like makes a successful investor in hindsight or in the records and history is like the number of zeros you've created, right? Like, or you have amassed. Versus ours, what makes, I'll give you one example. Like one of my favorite vendors, partly because she doesn't complain very much at all, actually. Been with us from like day 2, I think, way back to 2015. Her success for being at the night market is spending time with her sister and her kids and her husband and like previously her mother, her parents under the tent. They don't do anything with food 6 days a week. But on Saturday, their success is just being able to spend family time together for like the 8 hours of the night market plus the whatever prep time before or breakdown, and that is their motivation to be there. Beyond me, like sort of that is the sort of things I like to harp on about like the Queen's, or not harp on, but the things I like to sort of promote with the Queen's Night Market, because that doesn't exist at any other event, because at no other event in New York City, food-focused event, do you have the luxury to do that. Like if you're not making your money, if you're not selling, you're like losing your shirt, right? Like, but the night market is one such that like it has this aura of vendors come because for all sorts of reasons. So some of them, so like that's one success story, and I mean that very like sentimentally, like that is just a success story. We have another vendor who has now, I don't know, 12 shops in like the Northeast, and like his desire is to take over the world, and he seems to be like on his path to do so. He's got business chops and he's good at marketing and all that stuff, and he's gone on to do what he intended to do. The difference there is like complete motivation, like aspirations. What are your ambitions? And so it's hard for me to categorize and create buckets out of these vendors, because we've created a quasi artificial like planned economy kind of thing where success is not how much your sales are, but whatever you want it to be. And we've created enough leeway in terms of cushion and the price and the investment that it can be that.
Yeah.
That makes sense. That's like super lofty.
So let's take our viewers and listeners, let's walk into the night market at 400,000 square feet.
It's pretty close. Like when we flex our gates, it's pretty close to 300. It's definitely 300,000, sometimes close to 400,000 square feet.
Okay, so let's walk through. You're going to be my tour guide.
Sure. So you can enter, if we're being literal, you can enter through the north gate or the south gate. The north gate is mostly for people coming off the subways or parking lot. The parking fills up very quickly. And the south gate is for most people sort of either cutting across the park, Flushing Meadows, or just coming up there locally. They're both pretty busy. And as soon as you walk in, you're immediately sort of immersed in a wave or sort of a sea of blue tents and orange tents. About 75 blue tents. Each blue tent is a food tent. And about 35 orange tents. And each orange tent is art merchandise. And it takes, that's over 105, 110 vendors on any given night. It takes a while to sort of, if you haven't been, it takes a while to orient yourself and, to realize that there are like 3 alleyways, pathways full of vendors. And so most people, I've often heard they walk in and they're like, oh, it's not so big. And then they realize that there's another turn, and then there's another turn, and there's another turn. And they're like, oh my God, that's overwhelming. You'll see sort of smoke coming, and mostly the skewer vendors have smoke like coming up the wazoo. They have charcoal, which makes for a great picture, but their neighbors are not particularly happy. And you'll see, we curate, as I said, a rough proxy for diversity, if you can still use that word, but by sort of country. And we have a quota generally of no more than 2 representatives from a country in any given night. And
you have like 100 countries.
We've represented, since we started, we've represented like 103 countries through their food. And, we can talk about the curation a bit later if you want, but essentially it's the one parameter outside of the country quota is that you have to sell what you grew up eating.
Which I think is really fascinating. But let's talk about it now.
Okay, sure.
Let's talk about the curation now. If you could only have 2 vendors from a particular country, right? How do you adjudicate that? How do you decide who those 2 vendors are going to be?
It's tricky. It's trickier for some countries than others. There's priority for people who have been there before. And if I have 100 applicants from Colombia, it's just some sort of like, is one grandfathered in because they've been there so long. Like there's a soft spot for people who came in 2015 because they took a huge risk on whatever the hell I was doing. And so like anyone from 2015 kind of has a little bit of a easier path getting in. And outside of that, it's like story / what has New York not seen before. So the entire one of the points of the Queen's Night Market is, can you tell stories? Can you perpetuate traditions that are close to being lost? And so some of that means, if there's a dish that I've never heard of, or most of New York has never heard of, that either means it's not super popular in New York yet or anymore, or like it's just such a small percentage of people that are practicing it, or perpetuating that tradition, that like I would love to get it out there in the world. And like maybe in so doing, there's an article written about it for one time, and maybe someone thinks 5 minutes about it, and then all these traditions are going to be something very different in 20 years time. So trying to preserve these little nuggets of stories or traditions for just however temporally I can sort of do so. So that's just like, it's just a weird mix of like how I'm feeling that day, and whatever it is, and then there's the other side, which is 3 years ago, I think, we got an application from someone from Papua New Guinea. I was like, I don't even know what to eat, don't even know what food they source, but like, you're in. Like, if you can make it work, you're in, because like she was from there, and like I was like, that would be amazing. Like, we're probably the only food festival in the U.S. that has that representation. Turns out, like, we went through this whole thing. I was like, give me, what do you normally eat? What do you want to sell? What are you passionate about? And then, like, after she was accepted, she realized that she couldn't source the ingredients. Right. And so, like, sad story. Like, but like, so if you're coming from a country, again, the narrative has to match up, right? Like, one thing, the whole point of this, you have to sell what you grew up eating, is just to avoid someone going to culinary school and figuring out something trendy or making up a new dish and sort of selling it. And not for any reason. Like, there are plenty of markets in New York City and across the U.S. that do exactly that, cater to exactly that kind of like Instagrammability and profitability. That was never the point of the night market anyways.
So they get in, right? What are the most common problems that they come to you with? Am I going to be right if I guess the $6 cap on the food?
It's a pretty mixed bag of what people encounter. Some of it's marketing. So I'll give you a story. We have, I don't know if we have a target demographic, but like the people that come to the night market that aren't just locals, that like actually travel from like the other boroughs or like the tourists, are probably drawn because they're looking for food they can't find elsewhere, whatnot. I mean, outside of just the affordability part, because I think that's important. I'm not delusional. I think like that's the main reason we are like popular in the first place. But for the people who sort of make that extra trek, because you could go to the bodega across the street and presumably get a $6 sandwich or something like that. But so for the people that make the trek, that's not convenient for, I think they're there to eat, try foods and like experience cultures and bridge across different horizons and cultures. So for instance, we had this one vendor who went through the business seminars, and she served African food. I can't remember the details. Maybe it was West African or maybe it was Central African, just something that we hadn't had before. I was very excited. I was like, the narrative matched and like it's super cool. But she also had a restaurant in the Bronx and like lower Bronx. And her restaurant in the Bronx, if you saw her restaurant, and hopefully there's enough restaurants I think like this in the Bronx that I'm not singling anyone out. But like essentially the awning at her restaurant says, burgers, pizza, pasta, wings, Spanish food, whatever, like the hodgepodge. And there's probably some markets where that makes sense, is, make a one-stop shop for anyone that comes. But we had curated her because she had this amazing sort of African story that we hadn't seen before. But she came with the same signage that her restaurant did, which was like, and she was only selling the African food because that's all we curated. But like the sign was just the hodgepodge of like stuff that like people are coming to the night market specifically to avoid, right?
Right.
And so that was just sort of like a lesson in, marketing and, and another time we had a vendor who, I don't know if it's health code appropriate, but, she was doing okay. But then one day she decided to, hang those roasted ducks that you see all in Chinatown. And like from that day on for like the next 10 years, she's just had a constant line, like nonstop. And that was also just a sort of marketing thing. So that's one, is sort of just how do you present, who are the people coming. But there are also days of the night market where it doesn't matter who you are, what you brought, you're going to have a line because there's just so many stalls that 20,000 people can go to, right? Those are my favorite nights because the ones who are struggling or don't have the marketing chops or whatever, don't have the sophistication of, they can still do well, right? Like I remember last year, towards the end, we brought on a Kazakh vendor, and like it was literally a piece of paper that they held up and had like their son hold up with like hand drawn menu, and like it was so busy though that they sold out. Right? Like normally you'd be like, oh my god, they look like can't trust their food, can't trust their menu, can't trust anything about like it's so sketchy looking. But like it was so busy, people were so hungry for food that like they sold out like that. And they slightly improved over the year, like over the next 3 weeks because it was towards the end of the season. But like there's some nights that like you can't fail, right? Except for if you operationally fail, right? So there are some people that like their first night, they see how busy it is. They've come as visitors, and I'm very upfront. I tell them exactly the stats like that I know. It's like the average vendor sells 550 portions a night, right? Huge variability, but like that's where it is. And like I'll tell you, there are probably vendors that sell 100 a night, and there's some vendors that sell 1,000 a night on average. But like that's where this is. And this is one of the things we're talking about. The mindset of entrepreneurs. There are entrepreneurs that start and like, well, if the average is 550, I'm definitely selling 2,000, right? And so they just pack so much shit that like, there's not humanly possible to get to 2,000. Like you can't even take 2,001s in that amount of time, whatever it is, right? Like, so that's like one thing about like the mindset of like, those are the, if I was investing, those are the business people I would not invest in as entrepreneurs. But there's also the other ones that are like, the benefit of having such a low vendor fee, and in order to break even, assuming you're hiring just you and your family or your son or whatever, right? Like you need to sell 50 or 100. And so there are a lot of also like on the other end of the spectrum, people like just easing their way in, bring 200 portions and they're sold out in the first hour and they just have to sit there and wait. But then they get to explore and see what other people are doing. But like, just sort of here's the mean, here's the median, and here's the variability. Do what you want. But I try to give them some common sense things about like, imagine it takes your cash, like your son 30 seconds to just make the change. How does that affect, whatever, like how does it affect your operational efficiency? And imagine it actually takes you 2 minutes to fry XYZ versus like, just try to talk people out of this like 2,000, servings kind of like thing. I try to give a top 10 list of, random advice to vendors at these seminars. Like, please, like, at least smile and make eye contact with people that walk past you, right? Like, you never, like, and there's so much, like, as a visitor, like, you have to make a guilty feeling decision not to look at someone's stuff when they're, like, looking at you and smiling at you. But it's amazing how many of these, like, small businesses just don't do that. They're looking down at their phone, and, like, I get it. Like, the conversion rate is small and, like, all that stuff. But, like, if you're actually gonna do it, make the effort for those whole 8 hours. And like you can be tired, your eyes can like glaze over, but like for the majority of the time, try to like, impress upon like, and like that's something that like, just small things like that sort of I harp on. But
that has always fascinated me. Just some basics, right? When I was in Hong Kong, for example, there were these big groups led by a woman, almost always a woman, of little kids. And I'm a very naturally inquisitive person, and I will talk to any stranger. Yeah. And so I walked right up and said, "What's going on?" And she was really blunt, and she was like, "All mainland Chinese." And I went, "Okay, but," and she goes, "They send them here to learn manners." And I'm like, "Really?" And so we kind of got into it. And one of the things that she brought up first and foremost was when she gets them, they never look at her. They dismiss her. They don't shake her hand. Like these are just like really basic things to connect with another human being. And if you're going to try to be an entrepreneur and you're not doing that, I remember one guy I used to work with, and he was very analytical, right? Which he was really good at. But I noticed when we would go and we were trying to raise money for a company, when we would go to meet prospective investors, if he was there ahead of me, he was always in the corner looking at his phone. And I'm like, dude, come over and talk to these people. Maybe is there a story where you get somebody who started out like that, but then kind of grew to being a good entrepreneur?
A lot of them. I mean, like it's the learning curve there is incredibly steep. And one of the things I talked about earlier, maybe that was with Nick. the camaraderie between the vendors is a sort of remarkable thing that I never would have predicted. Maybe you could sort of work backwards and say, well, everyone at these other markets, and again, most of this was not planned, right? And so most of it's just sort of retrospect, conjecture about
Sure.
how something happens. But at these other events, they're all like frenemies or like competing, right? Like it's just, they want to be the person that makes the most money. At the night market, like I was just telling your colleague Nick that like they have like intergenerational, cross-cultural dinner parties all the time. Like they're friends, and like if we had a Persian lady who is on and off vendor. She usually comes by herself. Her vendor, her neighbors, whoever they end up being that week, often help her break down and load up her car, which is like just remarkable, weird stuff. So if you are, not the greatest entrepreneur when you first get there, at least for the night market. Like again, there's so many concepts of the night market just would never be sustainable outside of the night market. But for those 8 hours on a Saturday, my guess is those neighbor vendors are helping you along. Like, here's tips of the trade. Here's how I would do it. They always talk about lighting and how to engage customers, how to set up your stall. So you can get by. And my guess is if I'm not the one telling you, they're like them, which I try not to do. Like once they start, like I try not to like interfere with what they do. But that's not true with all the other. The colleague vendors are very quick to sort of give them tips on like branding and setup and optimization. So I don't know if we've we had a lady who came out of business school. She would load her car and she used it for like operations training because she wanted to potentially break into the food industry. She came out of a very stellar business school. Just loaded up her car with as much as she could fit. Like she, very good planning. She sort of knew the equipment, knew how much she could make, sold out every night. And then she used it as the first year. I think she only came 1 year, but used it as a training ground. And then launched a restaurant to like huge fanfare. Like it was like the number one on a list for maybe like 3 or 4 years ago. Did great, but then from what I know, she got married and moved to Paris. But for that year, she didn't know what she was doing. The first time she ever sold a thing herself was at the night market. Loaded up her cars to the brim, figured it out, and then sort of parlayed that into a restaurant. And so that's you can use it for the night market is used for all sorts of reasons, but that's like probably one where they really used it and sort of took the skill set and sort of expanded on it.
And how many people over the years, because you've got great call outs as best food in New York. I've read a lot of the stuff written about it. Yeah. Like, are a lot of people using it as a training ground to go on to launch other things like a restaurant, or in the case of the people selling merchandise, a boutique?
Sure. I don't know. I tried to keep track, but anecdotally, I'd say the last official survey, which means like me digging into my brain to figure out and remember who came through, like maybe 30 or 40 restaurants came out, and maybe like 10 or 20 retail shops came out of it. No.
So, okay, let's continue on our tour. We see that they're color coded. The people selling food are one color, merchandise another. What sorts of merchandise would you find there?
It's funny. So there hasn't been that much evolution in the night market, for better or worse. But the curation of the retail stuff and the merchandise has. When I first started the night market, I really chased after this sort of cultural representation kind of thing. And so both through the food, so that part hasn't changed, but also through the art, I tried to get culturally representative, diverse art. So that meant like African art and, Ecuadorian art and, Chinese art and all this sort of stuff. On a completely aside, I also tried to do that with entertainment. We had all these sort of unique musicians and instruments that you'd never seen before. And anyways, on the food, it caught on. It made sense and became sort of sustainable in terms of at least the crowd. And as long as the vendors are selling enough, like that's all that matters in terms of like the economics of it. It didn't really work at the retail side because one, maybe the price point, and two, maybe no one's coming to buy African art, right? Or how do you even get it home, that kind of stuff. So we sort of shifted more towards at least either the New York part's still the same. So it's like locally designed, locally made, or locally curated. So we still avoid mass production socks and that kind of stuff. But it's become a little bit more what will people actually buy?
So you'll see a lot of, there are a couple tents, and we still I try to maintain a pretty considerate mix of stuff. So if there's someone selling like anime stuff, I won't have more than one out of the 35, or more than two out of the 35, crochet stuff and paintings and stuff like that. So like you'll see some toys, you'll see a fair amount of art, ceramics, crochet, whatever, so like some novelty stuff. So yeah, whatever, but it's like still insist that it's not just mass production stuff.
And same rule apply for the vendors selling merchandise. Let's say you're from Iceland.
Yeah.
Is the things that you're selling of Icelandic origin something you grew up with?
Yeah, less so. Like something like we still like, to the extent that there are some things like that. We have a Japanese vendor who's been with us for a long time. Sells like, very traditional Japanesey stuff and like, nice chopsticks and that kind of stuff. But we also have like really young kids selling, anime toys and plushies and stuff like that. So, we try to keep it mostly sort of culturally appropriate and representative, but also mostly just focused on that it's like locally, the business owner is either locally designing it, locally producing it, or locally curating it. So it's a little bit, it's moved away from like sort of the cultural representation, but that's just that was a pure economic thing, right? Like we could curate it with all the sort of, esoteric art stuff, but the vendors just weren't doing it.
And it seems to me that you've allowed a lot of emergence, right? It doesn't sound like, other than your cap on pricing, you can't have any more than 2 representatives from a particular country. Are there any other rules that you have, enforce, waive?
Yeah. Not so much. There are in the weeds stuff, and for better or worse, like no vendor is allowed to leave before you close, even if they sell it in the first hour. They're not allowed to break down. They can stay. They can go explore the market. They can sit in their tent and just smile at people and tell people what they could have had. When we first created the performer, like when we were curating performances, we have like 3 or 4 live performances a night. I was very much about the sort of cultural stuff and like lots of dance troupes and lots of, esoteric, very specific, unique musical instruments. And sometimes they would like fall on deaf ears, or like it was hard to amp them up. They were historically acoustic without, and so like there are a lot of times we curate these really cool things that no one had ever seen, but no one cared, or you couldn't hear it, So we've definitely, we still try to sprinkle those in as much as possible, try to do better in sort of amping them up and giving them a platform. But we've also just created a lot more like just local bands that people like, right? Energetic. So on those 2 fronts, I would say, I followed a little bit more what is appealing and engaging versus, with a heavy hand.
And how are the entertainers doing the performances? How are they compensated?
So for the first 3-4 years, they weren't. They did it at pro bono. And then honestly, like, my wife probably thinks I'm the worst human being ever because she's an artist. Like, she's probably like, you underpay these people, which is probably true. It's very true. It is true. But like, I just didn't have a budget. Like this thing was run on a shoestring it still kind of is. So the first 3 or 4 years, they just did it pro bono for the huge audience that they got. And then, then I got a grant a small grant, arts grant that I started divvying up. And then when I either lost the patience or didn't have capacity to keep re-upping or reapplying for the grants, I just sort of made a small budget for it out of it. So we pay them, disproportionate to their talent check in the other way. But,
But can they also be like buskers and have an open?
They can't. No, they also accept tips. So some of them make very, very good money in tips. Like the the same ones that would do really well on the subway station do really well there in terms of tips. Like we still give them, cut them a small check, honorarium, but like some of them do really well.
And you mentioned that the enterprise itself is a bit still shoestringy. Yeah. So what is your business model?
So hopefully there's not too many business people listening to your podcast because it's terrible. It's like the worst idea ever. To be honest, again, like this is so much about my motivation doing it, and like the idea that at least 11 years ago I thought I could fall back on something, right? Like I thought, even if some of the partners at my law firm didn't like me, enough of them did that I could probably go back and like maybe even do relationship stuff, whatever. Like, it's funny you mentioned some of your horses staying in the corner when they arrive before you. Like, I am totally that guy unless there's something I need to have done. Right. So like in a vacuum, if I'm not looking to fundraise or I'm not looking to schmooze, like I'm the guy in the corner, like pretending to look at his phone. I'm not even looking at my phone. I'm like pretending to look at my phone just so I don't make eye contact with anyone. But if it's in a room, like I have to talk to these people and like there's I have an agenda, then I'm out and schmoozing. And so anyways, the motivation for this idea, like I literally thought I'd spend a year doing it. It would crash and burn. The question I started off with is, why is there no night market in New York City? And I thought after a year I would have answered that question and then I'd move to New Orleans. So when I came out with this stupid idea, I was like, okay, here's what I will do. And here's how I'll force my own hand. And so a lot of this is creating a structure where I cannot deviate from it, right? So I created a structure. I went out publicly. I was like, look, this idea I have, what I will do, one is I will never profit from vendor fees, which means as a sort of practical matter, I'll figure out whatever my operating costs are and essentially divide that by the number of vendors. For as long as this thing has legs, like that will always be the case. Stupid idea, right? No room for profit, period. Like from the day one. And I thought, okay, well, if I'm so lucky and I like toot my, like if this catches fire, like maybe I'll get some sponsors, maybe I'll like run a bar, whatever it is. But like to start it, in order to sort of create this structure where nothing costs more than $5, the only way I can convince any vendor to do it, because there was no case study, right? It was just like I had to convince vendors like it was worth it to sell things for $5 when they could go to any other event and sell it for 10 or 15. So I was like, look, from day one, I will never veer from I'll never make $1 from your vendor fees. Burned so much cash, right? Like that idea, because like the idea wasn't at capacity the first few years, and like overestimating all sorts of things like a terrible entrepreneur does. And so that was the first thing. That was like a terrible mistake, terrible idea. And like so much so, but it got tons of buzz. Right, like there's one thing that like is super lucky with the night market is had a honeymoon with the media for 11 years now. Like we put something out and like I was using this case. Someone asked me, we don't have to talk about it on the show, but like I'm in constant like fundraising mode. Actually, not constant. Like over the last 2 years, I've been fundraising mode, trying to hit up foundations and philanthropists. And someone asked me yesterday, like what's your strategy for going after philanthropists? Like no success yet, but like how do you get these meetings that you have? And I was like, you know what? I don't know. I usually cold email any email address I can find. And what often happens in these meetings I get is that the person who receives it has been to the night market. And they're like, I fucking love the night market. It's the coolest thing ever. Let me see if I can get some people to look at it. And that's the same thing that happens at City Hall or like, any company. Like the difference between the people who have been and haven't been is really just like, oh my God, let me do what I can. So the reason I brought that up is with reporters. Like every reporter has been trying so hard to get the night market like headlines or like good reviews or whatever they do, because they like, this is how they choose to spend their Saturday nights. And in year 2 or year 1, I remember talking to a reporter, and it was the exact same time as Anthony Bourdain was trying to create his Bourdain Hall. And a reporter told me like 2 press releases hit her desk that morning, one from Anthony Bourdain and mine. And she was like, I wanted to write about yours, but then my editor made me write about the other one. So I like convinced the editor that I could write about both. I think in year 3, we finally got to like enough capacity with vendors. And so it broke even, and then like it got the okay to start a bar. And then, it was kind of sort of humming along. Like the entire time, like it wasn't until year 9 that I had a employee. I hummed along till the pandemic. And then that's when sort of I feel like, at least anecdotally, it may not actually be true in retrospect and if you ran the data, but that's when like inflation started to like really test the $6 limit that we had. So then I started freaking out about the $6 price cap. I was like, at some point the economics are such that selling something for $6 is a losing proposition. And so out of the pandemic, not to name drop, just to name drop or give props, but like, someone approached me and said, would you like a big bank sponsor? I was like, of course I would. And so Citizens Bank came in. They were just broken into New York City. And they were looking for things to sort of support, and someone from their outside marketing agency was like, you should do the night market. Like, it's the coolest thing ever. So that was 3 years ago. And my deal with them is basically, I want you guys to pay down half of the vendor fee. I mean, I tried to get them to pay the entire thing, but they agreed to pay down half of the vendor fee. So that, took, the base vendor fee from maybe like $200 down to $100, which I could justify was like back of the envelope, like almost accounted for the inflation for, like the cost inflation, both between labor and food costs. And so that happened for 2 years. We were like happy as a clam, but it's a tricky thing. The night market won't go away if I'm not able to raise the fund, right? But the economics for the vendors is such that like the price cap does have to be adjusted, which I have a personal obsession with keeping as long as humanly possible the $6 price cap. And as long as I can make it worthwhile for the vendors, I will do everything in my power to keep it there. So anyway, terrible business model. At the end of the day, terrible business model. So much so that I didn't have like a regular employee until two years ago.
Wow. Of course, the Costco hot dog is very, very famous because they lose tons of money on it. But that certainty that you're going to be able to go to Costco, eat, and apparently the hot dogs are pretty good. And so I could see why, even though it might seem irrational, I can see why 80% would vote no, keep it.
Yeah.
Because that's the draw, right? People know that they can go and get great food at a reasonable price. And obviously,
but
if inflation and everything else, then you're a bit fucked.
So for me, it's so much about the whole genesis of a lot of this part, probably a part I didn't speak too much about. After being a lawyer, I was traveling around a bit, trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And I'm always amazed, outside of like maybe Japan and Western Europe, like going to these markets, what a US dollar will do for you at a market, right? Like I remember 2 of the best things I've ever eaten in my life cost $1. Like one was a ceviche in Peru, and one was like 2 tacos in Mexico, like deep in Mexico, for $1. Like unreal, like unfair, to be honest, like completely unfair. So the genesis of the $5 price cap when I was no longer employed in New York City was like $1 is like inane. But like, what if you could take a $5 bill, anyone in New York City could take a $5 bill and get something, anything they wanted at any stall, period. So last year I had no names, but I was talking to this billionaire philanthropist, and some people had like lined up a direct meeting with this person. I was super excited. I was like, oh my God, is this it? And so we sat down, and this person said, everyone's told me I need to meet you. What are you doing? What do you have to offer? And I was like, here's the night market, blah, 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 and here's the $6 price cap. And she said, stop. That's your problem. It should be $10 price cap. I was like, no. It's the exact opposite. Like, I'm trying to... And she's like, no. Who in New York City cannot afford $10? And I was like, ask the like 7 million New Yorkers for which that's like, seriously, like it was
I know.
It was a terrible thing. And so our surrounding neighborhood is not affluent, right? Like, and so like for a family of 4, I may be saving them $20 a night out, which is not something to bat an eye at. It falls a lot on deaf ears, like because people like don't get it. Because most of the people I'm trying to fundraise from, the difference between the dollar doesn't make it, right? It doesn't register. It can't possibly. It's like a penny to them, which no longer exists. So like the night market doesn't go bust if I don't raise the money. At some point, yes, in the next few years, the price cap will go up no matter what, unless there's deflation, which seems not likely. So it's just a matter of like, so when I'm pitching people, it's this weird, like pitching the same people for whom that dollar doesn't matter is tricky. But also like, it's hard to pitch this angle. Like the one thing that people in Queens tell me, and like all the institutions, like you've put Queens on the map in a way that no one else has. Like Queens has the Mets in the US Open, and that's pretty much it. And you were talking about some of the accolades, which to me are pretty like crazy. In 10 years, like last year, Lonely Planet and the Financial Times listed us as a top 10 market in the entire world. Yeah. Which you're competing with markets with hundreds, if not thousands, of years of history, and in like 11 years, somehow we've sort of broken into this like crazy list. And so like we're getting New York City accolades. Again, I'm not like trying to pat myself on the back, but like trying to get into like how do you sell this thing to someone? Like we've gotten New York City accolades into lists that only Paris and Marrakesh and Hong Kong have been on this list for it. All of a sudden, not only New York City, Queens has this sort of thing. So I don't know. So there's this, there's so many angles, and then there's the other thing people will notice when they come to the night market, I think, is that there's just like this calm joy that like radiates over the entire event. And I could speculate all sorts of reasons why that might be, and I think affordability is probably a big one. But it's just like the biggest mass of New Yorkers happy, which is just a weird thing to like see in general, right? Like New Yorkers are always curmudgeonly and like bitter and hustling or whatever, but like for 8 hours a week, like they're just in perfect harmony, and they're specifically to sort of, for some to learn from their neighbors and sort of eat food that they haven't had, cross cultural. But some of them, they just want to like find a place to sit and drink and eat and find whatever. But like, there's something, I don't want to call it moving, but sort of like deeply satisfying about like, Saturdays at the Queens Night Market. Like, so much so, what baffles me more than, all these like accolades that we've sort of gotten is that probably once a week, maybe, on average, someone reaches out, either social media or like finds my email address, which is easy to guess. It's like John at whatever. It says like full stop, Queens Night Market is the best part about New York City. Like, to me, that is just probably inaccurate, but like just crazy that someone would say that, right? Like there's the Met, there's like Statue of Liberty. There's so much amazing shit in New York City that anyone would bother to write me personally and say like, you've created my favorite thing, or like my family's favorite thing. It's just beyond me. So, I'm always, trying to get myself out of running the Queens Night Market because it's taxing and terrible idea and all sorts of things. But like it is like hard to walk away from something people care so deeply about. That like the volunteering, right? The idea that someone volunteers. We're not a museum. We're not like a veterinarian, but people are still asking to volunteer is super weird to me.
As the doors open, right? Like what does the clientele look like?
I always say a cross section of New York City, right? Like, and that's the one thing people I think notice, and I think New York Magazine once said like it's the New Yorkiest of New York festivals, right? Like it is. It's been many years since we did a survey, but a very like impromptu survey. It was back then. It was 30% Asian, 30% Latin, 30% Caucasian, 10% Black, which is almost the exact breakdown of New York City, right? And it was amazing. Like I'm like, well, that's if I had to sort of on paper create an event for New York City, like that's exactly a demographic I would have picked. And so like that's how it happens. And like in terms of personal anecdotes, or sort of class of anecdotes is there's often, there's so many tiny neighborhoods in Queens and New York City for that matter, that often there are these enclaves where grandparents will never step foot outside these enclaves, right? And so what often I don't know how often, I'm like probably overestimating by far, but what happens is that these grandkids force their grandparents to come to the night market. And they're like, no, don't want to go, there's nothing I can eat. And the kid's like, no, I guarantee you'll find at least something that will remind you of home, whether it's like your neighboring country of origin, or whatever it is. Like you'll go and you'll find something and you'll be comfortable. And then like once they have that, they're like, oh, this was a good version, this was a terrible version, whatever. And then like the grandkids proceed to like push the envelope and sort of like, well, now that you try that, why don't you try this? Why don't you try that? Like get them outside of the comfort zone. And like happens all the time. Overestimating, I'm sure, but happens a lot. And that's like the great sort of the entire point of the night market. It was like that kind of like exploration and sort of like, and then the grandparents are out, get to like mingle with New Yorkers that they generally wouldn't see like ever.
Yeah, I mean, my own experience. I haven't been yet. I will be there for sure. But I've been to night markets in Marrakesh, in Cambodia, in Hong Kong, in Laos. They're really fun. They're fun, yeah. And like, I remember the first one I went to was actually in Marrakesh. And I was like, wow, this is like just a really, really good time. Are there opportunities kind of back to sponsorship? And by the way, like the billionaire who doesn't understand that
the difference between $6 and $10?
Like that's fucked up.
Yeah.
Like, come on. Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's a rarefied bubble, right, and I get that. Yeah. But you would think that they could at least think and extrapolate theoretically that for a lot of people, that's a lot of money. I mean, honestly, I think it's one of the big problems of New York right now is it's priced out like everybody except the rich. And that is not a good thing to happen. And and so that's why I'm enthusiastic about things like the night market, right? But like that, you've put Queens and New York on the map with that. That's also kind of extraordinary to me, right? And the other thing I love about it is, if you had come in with some kind of, this is the way it's going to be, with some kind of top down, there's got to be this number of these people, right? Like, it would have not worked. And because you let it evolve, and the friendships, all that kind of stuff. I think one thing that people really do crave, and one trend we're seeing, is just connection with other human beings. And like, this is the perfect stage for that to happen. What's the turnover in vendors like? Do you get a lot of new people, or get a lot of stalwarts who are always there?
We try. I mean, it depends on the year. I think it tracks in a weird. I'm not clever enough to sort of, nor do I have enough time to think about like how it tracks. But like last year, we actually had the least amount of turnover. I was surprised. Like, I aspire for like 50% or more in turnover, and I hopefully these guys have found the 50% of turnover that I hope turnover have found better things to do, or like, bigger profit margins elsewhere. But last year was a weird one. And I think it maybe economic uncertainty, or like more than like 70% of our vendors reapplied, which was exceptional. And so we had a really hard time trying to figure out how to like create turnover without being an asshole saying like, you're done. And so it really depends on the year. I mean, there are some years where, I don't know, maybe there are a lot of food festivals and they all decide to go to a more profitable one. I don't know. And like the turnover is much more natural and like closer to where I would like it to be, just to keep things fresh. And but last year was a weird, tricky one. So we had to we do silly things like, okay, well, for the ones on the fence, will you be willing to split dates with another returning vendor just so we can create an extra tent for new ones? And so it really depends. But somewhere, if I, in a vacuum, I'd love for there to be about 50% turnover or so.
And the intent there being just giving additional opportunities to new people.
Yeah, 10 years, 15 years down the road, it won't happen as a practical matter, but like I would love to have a tent for every sort of country of origin represented in New York City. Like, that's always been the ideal. And that's why, again, that's the only reason we sort of count country flags, right? Otherwise, like, China has like 10 billion cuisines, and like, so does every country has so many nuances. So like, it's such a terrible, terrible proxy for how to count diversity or storytelling, but it's the only one that like I can. Otherwise, you're caught in a sort of nonstop trying to figure out the number of regions you've represented. So, creating spaces for these, vendors and countries whose stories haven't been told, or at least featured.
On the China question, are they serving American Chinese, or are they serving real Chinese?
So the thing, this is the nuance the workaround, right? When I started the night market, and even still, there's persistent questions. There are people like to call. I think I wrote a piece on this for the University of Michigan alumni. Maybe I think I did. They often use a phrase or adjective, authentic, right? And a lot of people who describe New York with the best intention, or describe the Queens night market with the best intentions, always call it like authentically New York, or authentic vendors, or whatever it is. And I'm always like, I would never choose to use the word authentic, because to me it means like it only has a definition when you talk about inauthentic, right? And like inauthentic means some sort of like mental state where you're trying to dupe someone, or you're trying to like pass something off as something else, which I'm not a judge of that. I don't know who could be a real judge of that. And so the reason it got formulated as you have to cook something you grew up with. Like, if you grew up with it, it has a tradition, right? Like, whether it's only within your lifetime, within your family, or ideally, or maybe in other ways, it's like it might reflect a tradition passed down from grandparents or great grandparents and that kind of stuff. I don't know, and I don't care, as long as it is a tradition in your family, and like you can extrapolate up or sort of work up the ladder as far as you can. Doesn't matter to me. Like, but like if you grew up eating it, at least I can at least rest assured that it has some tradition in your family. And the rest, like, if it happens to reflect, 1,000 years worth of traditions, awesome. If it doesn't, so be it. In a case in point there, right? How it worked out in practical matters. This year we, for better or worse, featured a pizza bagel vendor, right? Very American, obviously, very Americana. But sure, like I grew up eating pizza bagels, right? Like has nothing to do with my whatever Asian heritage I have, or nor much to do with my like being born in Texas or any of that stuff. But I did fucking eat pizza bagels like up the wazoo, and so did this guy. And so who am I to say like that is not important, like culturally or tradition? Like it fits every like narrative or sort of specific curatorial parameter that we have. So I was like, sure, you can do it. Like we didn't have like that many American. We didn't hit our quota of American vendors, and so they were a huge success. Now someone might look at it and be like, oh, that's totally like not up your curatorial alley, right? Like, but in terms of like the letter of the law, it was exactly the kind of thing we should be like. I'd curate, right? Like you convinced me that you grew up eating it, and period, right? And so but it skirts a lot of tricky questions about authentic, inauthentic. So the reason it came up, your question is, we've had a fair number of like Latin Chinese cuisine, right? Like there's a lot of Chinese cuisine in South America, and a lot of these families have grown up eating it. And so like I don't use the word fusion or inauthentic or whatever. Like if they grew up eating it, passes muster to me. So we end up with probably some versions of like if a kid grew up eating like certain kind of rolls a certain way, like so be it, right? Yeah. That doesn't quite answer your question, but it's kind of like whatever anyone grew up eating and has a passion for.
And then how do you deal with what I have to suspect is a lot of health code, red tape, all of that?
Yeah, it's our landlord has a private operating agreement. They were built for the World's Fair or Hall of Science. So our direct contract is with this museum who gets to sort of oversee their own thing. If we had to sign a contract with parks, there's so like the bureaucratic headache and the cost balloon, like it wouldn't exist. So also we are public land, but like privately operated. So we don't have to seek the same permits that someone on the street does because we're quasi private property and like so we skirt that one. And then in so doing, like the health department has a whole set of codes for pop-ups, which are, for better or worse, a little bit more lenient in terms of like how the kind of infrastructure you need. And so we luckily fall into sort of all these more convenient buckets or exceptions of rules. And so like, we still enforce all the same permit, like the required permits and the safety and all that stuff. But like, it just so happens that they're a little bit less onerous because of all these circumstances.
Yeah, right out here, there's the farmer's market. And again, me being me, I would go and just drill these people with questions because I was trying to figure it out, right? Like, how are you? There was the same guy for years and years and years. And like, I'm like, how are you making money? Because I'm fascinated by that, right? And so like, walk me through your day. When do you leave upstate New York to get here? And it's like at insane times. But when they walk me through the whole thing, I'm like, okay, you actually are making money despite all of the particular things going on. Very different for a farmer's market, though, because I don't see that as much of a launching pad. Like you want to start a new restaurant, you want to do that. Whereas your night market seems like the ideal environment if you want to test out a particular food or a particular style. As you mentioned earlier, like it's not going to break you. And so what do you see for like the next 5 years? Just banging along, or?
I do not know. I generally don't plan more than a year in advance because I'm constantly thinking this will be the last year I do it. I've been wrong 10 years now in a row. So it's a little bit of the same. Someone asked me someone asked me 3 days ago, what would you change about the night market if you could go back in time? And I didn't expect the question. So I said, I would have had someone else start it. Because I do think it should exist. Like, I think the concept should like is good, solid. Again, the business model is admittedly the worst thing in the world. But it's got, so many New Yorkers have come to love it. So many entrepreneurs have used it. Like, some of them have used it as a sort of important income supplement or exclusive income. But like, would I think 11 years I'd still be doing it? I didn't think I'd be doing it more than 1 year. And that's also why I've been, I think, so transparent about everything about the night market, right? Like, I remember year 2, the Wall Street Journal did a profile, and they asked me all these questions about like financing and stuff. And it's like, oh, here's how much money I lost. Here's how much money I raised, and like blah blah blah. And then the article came out and it was like, this is how much money he lost. This is how much money he raised. And everyone's like, why the fuck do you tell him that? I was like, was I not supposed to? Oh my god, like I have no idea. Like, so apparently you're supposed to hide your finances from the Wall Street Journal, but like I was like, here it is. And so like I've been super transparent about like the curation. There's no secret sauce of anything I've done. And that was like, it goes back to like, I needed to do something where I didn't depend on specialized skills, right? Didn't depend on coding or sort of specialized knowledge or language skills. So this is what I came up with. And now I remember why I was talking about the honeymoon with the media the last. So 2 or 3 years after we launched, or like maybe even sooner than that, we got tons of buzz. People loved it, the idea anyways. And so for a time in my life, I was constantly fielding requests from different countries and different cities and different states asking me if I would come try to replicate what I was doing. And like, I haven't counted for like 8 or 9 years, but like at some point it was like 12 or 15 countries, like, like France, Russia, Australia were like, can you come? And I was like, no, if it's on Saturday, I can't come. But like, I was like, but I will tell you how to do it. Like, for better or worse. Like, if you can't find an idiotic guy who wants to like take on 3 jobs himself and like that, because that's how, like, that's the reason the $6 price cap is there, right? Like, because like presumably I'm doing a couple people's jobs and have sort of internalized as many expenses as possible. But like, look, I will sit down with anyone and tell them how I've done it and like be as candid as possible. And like, anyways, for a couple of years, there were not only night markets popping up left and right because everyone thought that was what made it popular, and then also all these events were trying to impose their own price caps on their own vendors, and like all of those price caps have like since disappeared, right? Like, it was a big thing for a couple of years, and everyone was like, "Oh, look at our price cap, look at our price cap," and like they've all let go of it. And then the night markets thing still goes strong. I mean, I think I would guesstimate that there's, since the Queen's night market, been maybe 1,000 night markets that have started. Like, some of them are just like fly by night, city says whatever. But my wife, my in-laws have a little shack in France on the coast, the Atlantic coast, called Normoutier, like famous for sea salt. Anyways, tiny, like, a couple thousand people maybe, and like they have a night market now. And like, my mother-in-law was like, "Look what you did! You started a fucking like night market in this tiny little seaside like town that like for no reason." So anyways, like, so basically the point I think was like transparency. Like, I've never turned down like a meeting to tell people how I did it, and like I'm usually probably overly candid in terms of like how bad it is, but like there's no secret sauce, and you have to remain committed to X, Y, Z. And so I think this all goes back to like, how do I envision 5 years from now? And I honestly don't and can't. And people have offered to buy it, but I know that it would change so much about it. And like one of them was like a sort of sports marketing company, and it would turn into like, I don't know, some sort of expensive corporate thing. And so I don't know, it's tricky. Like, I've been very, I think, transparent about my struggles with, do I stay in, do I get out? And I don't know the answer to that. Like, I'm still always looking for like someone to say like, I will take the reins from you. So much so, like, there was 3 years ago, I offered to sell it to the park, or actually I offered to give it to the Parks Department. So if you go back to 2014, when I sort of put out the first feelers and stuff about this, it was envisioned under the Unisphere, right? Like, I still think that this like an iconic spot would sort of bring so much together. It has a space for it. But that is like bureaucrat central, right? Like, the most iconic space in Queens is dead center of the, like, Queens' flagship park, all sorts of issues. But and like some of it was like corporate, like commercializing issues. Like, they were fearful that I was like commercializing the parks, whatever. So I was like, look, if that's really your concern, I will sell the entire project to you for $1. I will teach you to run it for 2 years. You actually get to internalize many more costs than I do because you already have the existing staff. Anyways, it's like crickets, like complete crickets. But like, I was so like, I just use it as a case in point that, I'm not so beholden to it. Like, I don't think, like, I'm happy for it to exist outside of me, right? Like, it's not my, like, I don't think I'm the only one that can run it. I don't think I have any specialized skills or knowledge about it. Like, I would love to see it exist, and I would love to not be the one doing it day to day, to be honest.
It also does seem to me, though, as you mentioned, the other places with the explosion of night markets, I think one of the reasons it's so incredibly successful is because of the breakdown of New York, right? Like, I've always thought of New York as a collection of, neighborhoods, really. And you can be walking around and 2 blocks, everything changes. And so that spirit of New York is somewhat unique around the world. But I think that's wild that you offered to sell it to them for $1 and just crickets.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
But hang on, doesn't New York like realize all of the goodwill that you are building for Queens and the entire city, right? Like that, there should be a value to that. They're just being politicians about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably, like, they're only thinking, in their administration, right? Like,
Right.
And so it's tricky. And, I still think it's a good idea. And if they ever wanted to broach that topic, I would totally do it. I was like, look, I will spend 2 years teaching you how to do it. And then, like, you could have the coolest thing. Like, I was trying to think of cool things parks have done, right? Like, and so, and just not a park connoisseur, but like, in Hot Springs, Arkansas, the parks has like, beer made from the hot springs water.
Yeah,
I think
I've
that's
heard
kind of a
about
cool
that. Yeah.
partnership. And like,
that
it's
is cool.
And like, there are a lot of things, and like, hopefully no one does this without cutting me in, but like, I had this idea. A friend of mine wanted to start a food company where they just use sort of foraged goods. And I was like, the parks department should get behind that. And you could forage like all your stuff, and like parks department can't use certain fertilizers and whatever. You can almost call it organic. And I was like, and they like also crickets. I was like, and that's when I used this case in point with the hot springs. I was like, look, they do it. They have these cool partnerships. Like parks have these sort of cool partnerships that if you sort of weren't so risk averse and I heard it out, like, yeah, whatever. You could get to know it. It's fine. But like, at least hear it out. But none of that.
So like, if it comes to pass, right, that somebody either buys it or takes it over, still New Orleans?
No, so I have a kid on the way in 2 to 3 weeks.
Congratulations.
And one of the things, the one thing I will never live down is like I promised myself and my wife, first myself before I ever met my wife, that I would never raise a kid in New York City. And then when I met her, like, of course we'll never raise a kid in New York City. And now, like, working on, like, kid 2's coming up, and we're still in New York City. And one thing I didn't expect that has come out of the night market, outside of, like, the night market, again, didn't think it was going to last more than a year, is how all of a sudden it's, like, my professional life is very tied to New York City. Like, not just the night market, but, like, now I sit on the board of NYC Tourism, which is like the official marketing arm. I sit on a couple other boards, all volunteer, don't make any money on it. But all of a sudden, like, I don't get much of a say about where New York City goes, but like very involved in a way, like, that I never thought like I would be. And now all of a sudden I care even more about New York than I did before. And so now it's like, shit, like for the 11 years, I had a New York business, but all of a sudden, like, it's put me in a place that's forced me to care even more about it, being on these, like, having these different roles that directly impact New York City, either like from a tourist perspective or a hospitality perspective. And so now I don't know. I still dream about my kids, soon to be plural, playing in a street with no cars, like, because that was my like formative years. Is like, I always use. I don't know if the last time you watched Wayne's World.
Great movie.
So like, there's a scene near the beginning where they play hockey. Yeah, and then one car stop and they stop for like 2 seconds and they come back. That was my childhood. Like not exactly like that. And I liked my childhood. I thought it was good. I skidded my knee enough times, broken off bones, like just the right amount. And like New York, I was like, oh my God, the New Yorkers are weird and like they're like so eccentric and like don't have a street smart about them. And so like, I don't know. Hopefully my opinion will change over the course of my kids' childhoods. But So yeah, I thought for sure I'd have long since left, but you know,
Well, New York gets into your blood, I think.
it
right?
does. No, it's intoxicating in all sorts of ways for sure. Like so now, you know, whereas I was convinced I would never raise a family in New York City, now I'm like trying to figure out would I be okay spending 6 weeks away, 6 months away. I don't know, like but I love New York City. But it does make me fear. Like again, I've never feared for New York City in my life in terms of like a city or people or whatever. But I am like, you know, the one thing about the night market I always say is like we've grown into our relevance every year that goes by, right? Like the affordability becomes somehow keeps topping the charts in a weird way. But like I've actually never, my nearly 20 years in New York now, like haven't ever felt it like I feel like it is now. Like, and you probably have a much better perspective on that, but it feels like you can see the divides, like the sort of chasms opening up as you like walk through New York City on a daily basis in terms of like affordability, the haves and have-nots, and that's kind of frightening to me. Like outside of politics, outside of all that stuff, like it feels like there is a growing gap between those who can be here and those who can't, and that is like all of a sudden scaring me in a way that like I'd never felt that before.
Yeah, it sucks.
Yeah.
And, it's so funny because you see what always happens, right? So Manhattan becomes unaffordable. And then all of a sudden, Brooklyn becomes unaffordable. And then Queens.
And one day Staten Island. One day Staten Island.
Yeah, Staten Island will be the last standing. Well, this has been absolutely fascinating, John. I look forward to coming. I'm actually really excited about
Please,
coming.
I'm so excited to have you.
I mentioned to you before we started to record, my wife is a street photographer of some note. And when I told her about it, she's like, how fucking cool is that? And that both of us had not seen it. I feel I'm a bit embarrassed.
No. It's like in terms of, I'm never fearful for how many people will come to the night market because there's probably legit 4 or 5 million New Yorkers who've still never heard of it, which is great. Like in terms of an audience, like that's enough for another decade. Like in terms of
terrific
novel.
Well, we have an odd last question
Sure.
for all of our guests,
Please.
and it is this: we're going to wave a magic wand, and we're going to make you the emperor of the world. You can't kill anyone. You can't put anyone in a re-education camp. But what you can do is we're going to hand you a magical microphone, and you could say 2 things into it that everybody on the planet, whenever their next morning is going to wake up, and the 2 things that you said, they're going to think were their ideas, and they're going to go further. They're going to say, you know what? Unlike all those other great ideas that I got in the shower when I first woke up, but I never acted on them, I'm actually going to act on these 2 ideas starting today.
The first one I'd probably say is like, be nice. I'm like, I don't know if it's because I'm kind of a Southerner at heart, but like etiquette and manners we talked about earlier is like super important to me. And like, I feel like it's a dying thing, especially in New York City. And like, I'm not sure New York City ever had it, but like it feels worse these days. And I think I mean that in all sorts of ways. Like I reluctantly have a car in New York City, and like, you know, double parking is just like a terrible thing. Like anyway, I think one is be nice, like in every aspect of the day, like whether it's driving or door holding or saying thank you or, you know, whatever, line cutting. I don't know. It's the second one, huh? Maybe can that be both of mine?
Well, theoretically, we could take be kind and just have basic good manners, right? Like you can get very far in life. In fact, I went on a rant about people like not having manners. Like good manners can get you into so many rooms and situations, and it's just like they're really basic. And, like the kids I was talking about in China, right? All the mainlanders who got really rich, right, send their kids there to learn manners because obviously they're seeing that, it's probably going to get them a lot further. So be kind, be nice, and have good manners. I'll give you a third one, though, if we put those 2 together.
Oh, my God. Now can I act for 3 now? If everyone in the world, including the policymakers, woke up and thought, like, let's make sure everyone has healthcare, I think that might be a good one, right?
There you go. Because you are incepting the entire population.
Right.
That will include the
Right,
regulators.
exactly. Right.
John, thank you so
Yeah.
much. Fascinating. I love what you're doing.
Thank you very much.